This is Module 2, and in this module we'll look at the largely linear theoretical framework that is used to explain the observations that we have just described in Module 1. We need to ask a few questions in order to build the case, and I've listed 4 questions here. For the West India coastal current, there are 2 questions. Why does the WICC flow into the wind during the winter monsoon? Why does upwelling set in by February of southwest India, earlier than the reversal in the wind? For the East India coastal current, there are 2 questions. Why is the EICC stronger during March-April when the winds are weak? Why is upwelling stronger of the west coast even though the alongshore winds are stronger of the east coast? Now, in order to save time, in the presentation I'm going to focus mostly on the first question, but in the notes I will deal with all 4. The basic theory that underpins the linear dynamics was covered in 2 papers and 1 PhD thesis, all dating back to the 1960s. Matsuno showed the kind of waves that exist in the equatorial ocean. Lytle showed that unlike in the mid latitudes, these waves propagate much faster as you come closer to the equator, which is the case with the basin of interest to us, the North Indian Ocean. And Dennis Moore in his PhD thesis showed how to reflect an equatorial Kelvin wave at an eastern boundary. The first application of this theory came in the Pacific. It was by Jim O'Brien and his students and Julian McCreary. Now, what you see here in this picture is the result of wind forcing restricted to a small patch over here in the western part of the equatorial Pacific. So this is the model basin, but the winds are restricted to this small patch in the western equatorial Ocean, western equatorial Pacific. Now, these winds drive a circulation that is not restricted to the regime of the winds. There are waves that they set up. This is the equatorial Kelvin wave that propagates eastward, and when it impinges on the eastern boundary of the Pacific, it reflects as a Rossby wave that takes information back into the equatorial Pacific towards the west, and the signal also propagates poleward along the east coast of both North and South America. The theory came first, then its confirmation in observations. Enfield and Allen and Shelton and Davis used tide gauge sea level data to show the poleward propagation of sea level that is expected from the theory. It's curious, the same people, Jim O'Brien and Julian McCreary, moved on from the Pacific in the 1970s to the Atlantic in the 1980s and then to the Indian Ocean in the 1990s. In 1993, there came a landmark paper, McCreary, Kundu and Molinari, which forms the basis for much of what we know of the circulation of this basin. So why does the WICC flow poleward during winter? The first explanation came from Johannesson et al. In 1987. They said that the poleward West India coastal current during winter is associated with a cross-shore salinity gradient. So they said there is a salinity gradient with lower salinity at the coast compared to offshore, which sets up higher steric sea level at the coast and therefore a cross-shore pressure gradient, which will drive a geostrophic current into the equatorward wind. In 91, Shetty and his colleagues said that that's not true. What you have is an alongshore pressure gradient set up by the lower salinity in the south compared to the north, and they showed that this alongshore pressure gradient with higher pressure in the south could actually overwhelm the equatorward wind and therefore drive the West India coastal current into the wind. But if you look at the model of McCreary et al. 93, it did not include salinity, yet it could simulate the poleward WICC during winter. Even purely dynamical models that came later, they did not even include the horizontal variations of temperature that were present in the McCreary model. They also could simulate the poleward West India coastal current during winter. And that implies that the alongshore pressure gradient that you need to drive the West India coastal current into the wind is not coming from the alongshore salinity gradient, even if it is present. This alongshore pressure gradient is actually being set up by the higher sea level in the south compared to the north during the winter monsoon. And it turns out that this alongshore pressure gradient which overwhelms the longshore wind stress of the west coast of India, is due to Kelvin waves that propagate along the east and west coasts of India. Now, if you use simple models and force them only with west coast winds, you get a very weak high in sea level here. The red colors show you high sea level and the blue colors low sea level, and superimposed on that are the current vectors, surface current vectors. Now, you get a weaker sea level here compared to a simulation in which you have winds only blowing along the east coast of India. You have this pressure gradient here, high pressure here, low pressure here. It can drive a West India coastal current into the wind, but this is much weaker if you have only west coast winds. The stronger pressure gradient is set up if you have the east coast winds. So you have remote forcing from the east coast of the circulation of the west coast of India. In simple terms, if I want to explain the seasonal cycle of circulation as depicted in, say, a current meter observation of the coast of Goa, I need to invoke the entire basin. So though the talk will deal only with the boundary currents of the east and west coast of India, the model has to simulate the entire basin. So remote forcing from the Indian east coast is important for the seasonal cycle of the WICC, and it is this pressure gradient set up by both local and remote winds that drives the West India coastal current into the wind during the winter monsoon. The simplest model for the WICC is to use the Hermite functions, which describe the Rossby meridional modes on an equatorial beta plane. Just sum over them and you can get the seasonally reversing circulation. Upwelling starts earlier of southwest India for the same reason. The high in sea level and the lows in sea level, they are intimately connected to the currents, and as the Rossby wave propagates westward off the southwest coast of India, you see sea level dropping at the coast and the current reversing. Likewise, it is remote forcing that is responsible for the strong poleward EICC during March. As you can see here, when you have only east coast winds, you drive a stronger East India coastal current during July, and you get a very weak East India coastal current during March. But when you look at the remotely forced effect, there's a very strong impact of the remote forcing, remote winds on the East India coastal current, a very strong East India coastal current during March, and the remote effect is actually equatorward during July. That is what weakens the effect of the locally forced current. Upwelling likewise is stronger off the west coast of India because of this combination of local and remote forcing. Off the east coast of India, you find the remotely forced current weakening the strong upwelling that would have been forced by the local forcing during the summer monsoon. This is a picture of sea level shown every alternate month from the Topex Poseidon altimeter. It was these two altimeters were launched in 1992, and they revolutionized the study of the Indian Ocean because they provided a near synoptic picture of what was going on in the basin as far as sea level was concerned. So you can see highs in sea level and lows in sea level. These highs, for example, you can trace it right across the basin. The same thing happens with the lows in sea level. There is incessant westward propagation, and this is seen much better in animations, which I will provide along with the notes. So if you look at the theoretical framework, you can describe the circulation of the North Indian Ocean using this leaky waveguide. There are two waveguides. One is a coastal waveguide shown in red, and the other is the equatorial waveguide shown in violet. Energy leaks from one waveguide into the other. The equatorial waveguide is where you have the equatorial Kelvin wave. The coastal Kelvin wave goes along the coastal waveguide. But due to the reflection of the equatorial Kelvin wave at the eastern boundary, you have energy leaking from the equatorial waveguide into the coastal waveguide. So equatorial winds can force a circulation along the eastern boundary of the Bay of Bengal, and due to the propagation of Rossby waves across the bay in the rest of the bay as well. Likewise, Rossby waves are forced in the middle of the basin by Ekman pumping or wind stress curl. These Rossby waves also propagate westward, and when they reflect off the east coast, they influence the East India coastal current. The Kelvin wave turns around Sri Lanka and it propagates poleward along the west coast of India. This coastal waveguide is separated from the equatorial waveguide because of the distance separating the southern tip of Sri Lanka from the equator. If Sri Lanka were closer to the equator, these two would merge, leading to likely very different dynamics. Just as energy leaks from the equatorial waveguide into the coastal waveguide at the eastern boundary, the Kelvin waves at the western boundary can leak energy into the equatorial waveguide at the western boundary. Now, this leaky waveguide merges the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, and the Equatorial Indian Ocean into a single dynamical entity, which must be modeled as a whole, even to simulate the seasonal circulation in parts. So, as I said, if I have a current meter observation of Goa, and I just want to explain the seasonal cycle of circulation there, I need to simulate the circulation in the entire basin. As in the Pacific, observational evidence came later, in this case much later than the theory. The theory dates back to the early 1990s. Observational evidence for remote forcing or the West India coastal current came only in 2008 and 2012. It shows that the currents of Goa, even in very near shore waters, are affected by winds as far down south as Kollam and even the east coast of India. So even in the near shelf waters, which are important for our activities, human activities, and for which we conduct our environmental impact assessments, this remote forcing of the circulation is important. So when we look at even the impact of industries being set up at Goa, we need to model much more than the circulation in a limited domain of the state.